Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased that you decided to join me to take a look at U.S. history. We try to take a look at U.S. history from a variety of different angles, try to identify the story behind the story. Sometimes we try to look at the odd things that have happened, and certainly examine the personalities that have made the American experience so unique in all the history of the world. In particular, we take a look at the U.S. Constitution, this wonderful document that has governed this country for well over 200 years. And we try to understand some of the complications and some of the problems that we face as a nation, day by day, year by year, month by month. In any event, I hope you're enjoying this and that you come back often because I will keep repeating these and posting them to YouTube so that you can relive the experience if you want to do it more than once. And I hope you do. Anyway, welcome and enjoy the presentations. Previously, we've taken a look at the terrible world of protest up through World War I in the United States. And now today, we're going to move on and take a look at protest since World War I. Yes, we are protesting people, and we have been that from the very beginning. Day one, America has been a place of one protest after another ever since the beginning. Like recently, there have been more protests than ever before. Let's go and refresh ourselves about Amendment number 1. Contemplating no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so even in the very beginning, the founding fathers knew that there would be protest, and they had to have a way to let protest happen. So, race riots. There's going to be a theme here if you start to listen to it. I'm not going to go into each one of these because there have been far too many of them, but you're going to see a common theme running through here, that there have been race riots all the way through America's history. So, especially in 1919, we had a real avalanche of protests that took place. And here you see a list of some of them. And they started in February, and this is only up through July. And then they continue on through the rest of July and on into the fall, and then finally, even when it gets into the late winter time, there are some protests that are taking place. It was a nasty time in America. So the Boston police strike is worth noting. September 9, 1919, police officers strike to gain recognition for their union and improve work conditions and wages. Police Commissioner Edwin Upton Curtis rejected the officers' demands. Boston Mayor Peters failed to reconcile the two sides, and he tried and he was unsuccessful. The strike resulted in chaos, with the Massachusetts State Guard finally having to come in and restore order. The strike led to several nights of unrest in Boston. Order was eventually restored by force through the deployment of the Massachusetts State Guard with volunteer support. Media coverage, both locally and nationally, painted the strike in a negative light. They portrayed it as a Bolshevik-inspired movement aiming to destroy society. And this is when the Bolsheviks have taken control in communist and make Russia, the Soviet Union, communist. The striking officers faced harsh criticism in the media. They were labeled as traitors, deserters, and linked to radical communist leaders. In other words, they called them agents of Lenin. Samuel Gompers of the AFL urged the strikers to return to work due to negative public perception. However, Commissioner Curtis refused to reinstate them. Governor Coolidge supported the commissioner, and he gained national attention as a result. There were 9 deaths, with 8 shot by the state guard. It ended September 13th with Curtis replacing all striking officers with new hires at higher wages. The strike hindered labor unions. The AFL wouldn't attempt to organize police officers for another 20 years, and Coolidge received the Republican nomination for vice president as a result of his actions in this strike.
September 9th, 1919. 10,000 people gather in Scully Square in Boston, Massachusetts. Rocks are thrown at streetcars. Stores are looted and destroyed. Who is to blame for this chaos? Since 1857, the pay for new Boston police officers was only $2 per day. Furthermore, strict working hours and poor conditions in police stations only exasperated the situation.
New recruits only got $2 per day. That's less than the wages of unskilled factory workers. We were required to work 7 days per week, and we could only take a day off every 2 weeks. Even then, we weren't allowed to leave town without permission. Our biggest complaint was the stations. Some of us were required to sleep at the stations at night in case they needed us, but they didn't have any beds, baths, or toilets.
The police grew fatigued from the unchanging conditions, so they decided to form a union.
We decided, like any other group of American workers, that we would form a union, and so we did. We were even affiliated with the AFL, and that really upset Mr. Curtis.
1,100 out of 1,500 officers joined the union. When Police Commissioner Edwin Curtis heard about it, he suspended 19 of the union's officers. A strike was inevitable.
We planned the strike for September 9th at 5:45 p.m. Over 1,000 of us walked out. Commissioner Curtis and Governor Coolidge knew about our plans, so it wasn't a surprise to them.
Governor Calvin Coolidge ordered the National Guard to patrol Boston during the time of the strike. Riots commenced that night as criminals looted many stores.
There were a lot of riots that night and the following nights. Criminals took advantage of the lack of police officers to rob stores and commit other crimes. We didn't support anything that happened that night. We just did what we had to do.
The striking police officers were never allowed to return to work. Commissioner Curtis was able to hire a completely new police force by mid-December.
And so then we had another strike during this time, the steel strike of 1919, an attempt by the weakened Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers to organize the United States steel industry in the wake of World War I. The strike began in September of 1919, and it ran until January of 1920. The AA had formed in 1876. It was a union of skilled steel and iron workers, which was deeply committed to craft unionism. However, technological advances had slashed the number of skilled workers in both industries. Tulsa Race Massacre, a riot. The Tulsa Race Massacre, sometimes called the Greenwood Massacre or Black Wall Street Massacre, from May 31 to June 1, 1921, when mobs of white residents attacked black residents and businesses of the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Called the single worst incident of racial violence in American history, the attack on the ground and from private aircraft destroyed 35-plus square blocks of the district, the wealthiest black community in the United States at that time, known as Black Wall Street. More than 800 people were admitted to hospitals, and 6,000 black residents were interned at large facilities for several days. The Oklahoma officials recorded 36 dead. They did commission in 2001 an investigation, and it confirmed 39 dead, 26 black, and 13 white, based on contemporary autopsy reports, death certificates, and other records. The commission, however, gave overall estimates from 75 to 100 to 150 to 300 dead, and no one really knows, and no one will ever know, all of the facts of this terrible incident. Ku Klux Klan marches. In the early 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was at the peak of its membership, with 3 million members out of a population in this country of 115 million. So it was a big, big organization. The growth of the hate group was fueled by the 1915 release of the silent film Birth of a Nation, which portrayed members as heroes, coinciding with the widespread xenophobia after World War I. The Ku Klux Klan hatred was directed not only against black people, but also against European Catholic and Jewish immigrants to the U.S. In 1925 and 1926, the Klan held 2 massive marches on Washington, D.C. City officials fiercely debated whether to allow a white supremacist organization known for lynchings, violence, and terror to parade around the U.S. Capitol. The decision was ultimately made to let them march, albeit without their masks. The so-called conclave drew upwards of 50,000 Klansmen who marched through the city in what was, I would only have called, and anyone else did at the time, a chilling display. Then there are 2 Coxey's armies, so I'm going to try to clarify which is which. Coxey's Army with an EY was a protest march by unemployed workers from the United States led by Ohio businessman Jacob Coxey. The 6,000 men marched on Washington, D.C. in 1894, the second year of one of the worst economic depressions the U.S. ever experiences. Officially, the Army of the Commonwealth in Christ, its nickname came from its leader. It was the first significant popular protest march on Washington, and the expression, quote, "enough food to feed Coxey's army," close quote, originates from this march. Then there's the other Cox's Army. Father James Renshaw Cox was a Pittsburgh Roman Catholic priest, a pro-labor activist, and a candidate for president. In January 1932, Cox led a march of 250,000 unemployed Pennsylvanians, dubbed Cox's Army, on Washington, D.C. to stir Congress to start a public works program and increase the inheritance tax to 70%. Pennsylvania's Republican governor, Gifford Pinchot, backed Cox's march. Pinchot hoped Cox would back his own hopes for the Republican nomination for president. Cox, however, had other plans. Herbert Hoover, the president at that time, embarrassed, launched an investigation. How was Cox able to purchase enough gasoline to get the marchers to Washington? And they suggested maybe the Vatican or Democratic support of Al Smith funded the operation. It turned out that Andrew Mellon had quietly ordered his Gulf oil gas stations to dispense free gas to the marchers. Hoover removed Mellon from his post as Secretary of the Treasury. Bonus Army. The Bonus Army was a group of 43,000 demonstrators made up of 17,000 U.S. World War I veterans, together with their families and affiliated groups who gathered in Washington in mid-1932 to demand early cash redemption of their service certificate. Organizers called the demonstrators the Bonus Expeditionary Force, to echo the name of World War I's American expeditionary forces that went to Europe to confront the Germans, while the media referred to them as the Bonus Army or Bonus Marchers. The demonstrators were led by a Walter Waters, a former sergeant. Many of the war veterans had been out of work since the beginning of the Great Depression. The World War I Adjusted Compensation Act of 1924 had awarded them bonuses in the form of certificates they could not redeem until 1948. Each certificate issued to a qualified veteran soldier bore a face value equal to the soldier's promised payment with compound interest. The principal demand of the bonus army was the immediate cash payment of their certificates. They were hungry and they were desperate and they needed the money. U.S. Attorney General William T. Mitchell ordered the veterans removed from all government property. Washington police met with resistance, shot at the protesters, and 2 veterans were wounded and died. President Hoover then ordered the U.S. Army to clear the marchers' campsite. Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur, who will become famous in World War II later on, commanded a contingent of infantry and cavalry supported by 6 tanks. The bonus army marchers with their wives and children were driven out and their shelters and belongings were burned. And the thing that enraged Americans was this was our own U.S. Army firing on its own citizens within the United States. And by the way, the place where the bonus army camped was later made into where the Pentagon sits today. Ford Hunger March. The Ford Hunger March, also called the Ford Massacre, March 7, 1932, by unemployed auto workers in Detroit during the Great Depression. They marched from Detroit to Dearborn in a confrontation, and 4 workers were shot to death by the Dearborn police and Ford Motor security guards. More than 60 were injured, many by gunshot wounds. The march was organized by the Unemployed Councils, a project of the Communist Party USA. It was an important part of a chain of events that resulted in the unionization of the U.S. auto industry. And so, race riots during the 1930s continue. And again, I'm not going to mention all of these, but you see the list continues on almost month by month. Not so many in the winter, but as soon as we get to spring and summer, the riots take place. One of the worst was the Detroit race riot of 1943. It took place from June 2nd to 22nd. 34 people were killed, 433 were injured, and almost 2,000 were arrested during a 2-day riot that spread through the city like wildfire. It occurred in a period of dramatic population increase and social tensions associated with the military buildup of World War II. Existing social tensions and housing shortages were exacerbated by the arrival of nearly 400,000 migrants, both African American and white Southerners, between 1941 and 1943. The new migrants competed for space and jobs as well as against European immigrants and their descendants. 1934 West Coast waterfront strike lasted 83 days. The longshoremen in every U.S. West Coast port city walked out. The strike peaked with the death of 2 workers on Bloody Thursday and the San Francisco general strike, which stopped all work in the major port city for 4 days, and that did lead to settlement. The result was the unionization of all West Coast ports. Strikes in other industries in Toledo and Minneapolis, led by the Communist League of America, were catalysts for the rise of industrial unionism in the 1930s, much of which was organized through the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. There used to be the AFL and the CIO, and they were separate organizations. And then eventually they found that to keep the labor movement going, they had to merge. So today we have the AFL-CIO. The Old Miss Riot of 1962, a battle of Oxford was fought between Southern segregationists and federal and state forces September 30th, 1962. Segregationists were protesting the enrollment of James Meredith, a black U.S. military veteran at the University of Mississippi called Old Miss. 2 civilians, one a French journalist, were killed during the night, and over 300 people were injured, including 1/3 of the federal law enforcement personnel who were deployed. More race riots in 1964, and here you see the list unfolding as we go through the summer summer being hot, and it stimulates all kinds of hot reactions. Selma to Montgomery marches, Bloody Sunday. The Selma to Montgomery marches were 3 protest marches held in 1965 along the 54-mile highway from Selma, Alabama to the state capital of Montgomery. The marches were organized by nonviolent activists to demonstrate the desire of African American citizens to exercise their constitutional right to vote. On Bloody Sunday, March 7, 1965, some 600 civil rights marchers headed east out of Selma on U.S. Route 80. They got only as far as the Edmund Pettus Bridge, 6 blocks away, where state and local lawmen attacked them with billy clubs and tear gas and drove them back into Selma. By highlighting racial injustice, they contributed to passage that year of the Voting Rights Act, a landmark federal achievement of the civil rights movement.
We line up in twos to walk from Selma to Montgomery.
We're marching today to dramatize to the nation, dramatize to the world, that hundreds and thousands of Negro citizens of Alabama, but particularly here in the Black Belt area, denied the right to vote.
But we understood while we were walking through the streets of Selma that the sheriff of Selma and Dallas County had requested that all white men over the age of 21 to come down to the courthouse that Saturday night to be deputized, to become part of his posse. We just kept walking. We come to the highest point on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Down below, we see a sea of blue, Alabama state troopers. A man by the name of John Cloud identified himself and said, "I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers." This was an unlawful march, will not be allowed to continue. Disperse and return to your homes or to your church. I said, "Major, may I have a word?" He said, "There will be no word." You saw these men putting on their gas masks. He said, "Troopers advance."
Troopers here, advance.
They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, trampling us with horses, releasing tear gas. I was the first person to be hit. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. I thought I saw death. I thought I was going to down that bridge. I thought it was my last nonviolent protest. And all these many years later, I don't recall how I made it back across that bridge to the church. I do recall being in the church. They asked me to say something to the audience. And I stood up and said something like, "I don't understand it. How President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam and cannot send troops to Selma, Alabama to protect people who only desires to register to vote."
And then we have the Watts riots that took place in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, August 11 to 16 of 1965. An African-American motorist on parole for robbery was pulled over for reckless driving. A minor roadside argument broke out, which then escalated into a fight with the police. Community members reported the police had hurt a pregnant woman, and 6 days of civil unrest followed. 4,000 members of the California Army National Guard helped suppress the disturbance, which resulted in 34 deaths and over $40 million in property damage, the worst unrest until the Rodney King riots later in 1992. And here we have still more race riots, 1967, and you see them unfolding one after the other. It was a long, hot, and miserable summer. The assassination of Martin Luther King stimulated a whole other set of riots that occur in many cities in 1968. And you see that list here, and some in Miami as well, by the way. Democratic National Convention in 1968, protest activity during the Vietnam War prior to and during that Democratic Convention in 1968. In 1967, counterculture and anti-Vietnam War protest groups had been promising to come to Chicago and disrupt the convention, and the city promised to maintain law and order. For 8 days, the protesters were met by the Chicago Police Department in the streets and parks of Chicago, while the U.S. Democratic Party met in convention in the International Amphitheater. It all climaxed in a police riot on the night of August 28, 1968. You may remember watching all of this stuff on the news. And here is a clip that shows some of the marchers. And at this point, this video clip is quiet, and the initial protesting was, in fact, orderly. It's only that it became escalated as the day.
I look at the confusion in this hall
This is Senator Abraham Ribicoff.
and watch on television the turbulent that is competing with this great convention for the attention of the American people. There is something else in my life, and that's the speech that I'm prepared to hear. When George McGovern was president of the United States, we wouldn't have to have this tactic in the streets of Chicago.
And this is Mayor Daley.
With George McGovern, we wouldn't have a National Guard.
He's being insulted, and he doesn't like it. His Chicago. He's the dominant person, the boss of Chicago.
How hard it is to accept the truth. It's a great opportunity for the President of the United States, George McGovern.
So then we have the Stonewall riots. The Stonewall riots were a series of spontaneous demonstrations by members of the gay community. They were against a police raid that began the early morning hours of June 28, 1969 at the Stonewall Inn in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of Manhattan. They are considered the most important event leading to the gay liberation movement and the modern fight for gay rights in the United States. Gay Americans in the 1950s and 60s faced an anti-gay legal system. Early homosexual groups in the U.S. sought to prove that gay people could be assimilated into society, and they favored non-confrontational education for homosexuals and heterosexuals alike. The last years of the 1960s were contentious as many social political movements were active, including the civil rights movement and counterculture of the 1960s and the anti-Vietnam War movement. October 14, 1979, for the nation's first national march on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. State shootings, a massacre. Kent State shootings of 13 unarmed Kent State University students in Kent, Ohio, by the Ohio National Guard, May 4, 1970. The killings took place during a peace rally against the expanding involvement of the Vietnam War into neutral Cambodia by the United States military forces, as well as the presence of National Guards on the campus itself. The incident marked the first time that a student had been slain in an anti-war gathering in United States history. The thing that incensed people is here were soldiers of the United States firing on our own citizens. 28 National Guard soldiers fired 67 rounds over a period of 13 seconds, and they killed 4 students, wounding 9 others. 4 students were killed and 9 others were injured, one of whom suffered permanent paralysis. All perished at the scene except for one who was pronounced dead later at the hospital. And then more race riots continue through 1969, 70, into 74. And you'll see names there that you would recognize if we paused on them, but there are too many to stop and look at each one. The Wounded Knee occupation on February 27, 1973, in which 200 Oglala Lakota and followers of the American Indian movement seized and occupied the town of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, the poorest reservation in the country. Residents of the area were captured at gunpoint and taken hostage. The protest followed the failure of an effort of the Oglala Sioux Civil Rights Organization to impeach their tribal president, whom they accused of corruption and abuse of opponents. Protesters criticized the U.S. government's failure to fulfill treaties and demanded the reopening of treaty negotiations. 76-77 marches on behalf of the Equal Rights Movement. May 1976, NOW, National Organization for Women, brought 16,000 supporters to Springfield, Illinois, to urge ratification by the Illinois legislature. In August 1977, 4,000 women and men marched down Pennsylvania Avenue to demand that President Carter take a more active role in efforts to ratify the ERA. Days later, activists donned jogging shoes for the first of what became five annual ERA walkathons that together raised $1.7 million for the ratification campaign. The next year, NOW organized over 100,000 people to march on Washington in 95-degree heat to press for an extension of the time limit to ratify the ERA. Having won the extension, the NOW activists organized a record 90,000 people to march on Chicago, again urging Illinois' ratification in the 1980 Mother's Day March for ERA. New York Blackout Riot. New York City Blackout Riot of 1977 was an electricity blackout that affected most of New York City July 13-14 of 1977. Unlike other blackouts that affected the region, namely in the Northeast blackouts of 65 and 2003, this was confined mostly to New York City and its immediate surrounding areas, and also in contrast to the 65 and 2003 blackouts, this one resulted in citywide looting and other acts of criminal activity, including arson. March for Women's Lives, NOW, April 1989, drew a record crowd of 600,000 that hadn't been seen in Washington since the Vietnam protests in 69 and 71. They held another rally of 350,000 that fall. The November 89 Mobilized for Women's Lives at the Lincoln Memorial. They broke their own record by bringing 750,000 abortion rights supporters for a massive April 1992 March for Women's Lives as another threatening case, Casey versus Planned Parenthood, was pending in the Supreme Court, a case that went in their favor, has since been overturned by the Dobbs ruling last year. March on Washington for lesbian, gay, and bi equal rights and liberation. October 79, for the nation's first national march on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. And then again in 1993, a march on Washington for gay rights. The liberation was a large political rally with 1 million people attending the march. April of 2000, the 4th National Gay March on Washington, named the Millennial March on Washington for Equality, drew another 800,000. October of 2009, National Coming Out Day. The National Equality March attracted 150,000 people on relatively short notice. And then there are still more riots in Miami and in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, and the Rodney King riots in 1992. And then there is the Rally for Women's Lives. 1995, more than 200,000 people gathered in Washington for the Rally for Women's Lives to stop violence against women. now marched again on April 14, 1996, when over 30,000 women and men gathered in San Francisco to fight the radical right. In 1997, a million-woman march of African American women filled the streets of Philadelphia with demands for justice and equality. April 2004, March for Women's Lives drew a record, and they're not sure, as it certainly was over 1.15. It could have been as much as 1.3 million people to Washington, D.C. The demonstration was led by a number of women's groups, and you see them listed here. The National Now organization, the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, Pro-Choice America, and so forth. The march was intended to address abortion rights, reproductive health care, women's rights, and others. Million Man March on Washington, October 1995. An estimated 850,000 African American men gathered on the National Mall in Washington, one of the larger demonstrations. It surpassed the 250,000 who gathered for the Martin Luther King speech in 1963. The Assembly of Black Men was organized and hosted by the Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan, who called for all able-bodied African American men to come to the nation's capital to address the ills of black communities and call for unity and revitalization of African American communities. Woodstock Musical Festival. Violent actions during and after the Saturday night performance included fans tearing plywood from the walls during a performance of the song Break Stuff. Sexual assaults were also reported. Vocalist Fred Durst stated during the concert, "Don't let anybody get hurt, but I don't think you should mellow out. If someone falls, pick them up." Durst said during a performance of the band's hit song Nookie, "We already let the negative energy out. Reach down and bring that positive energy to this MFing let yourself go right now, because there are no MFing rules out there." Partway through the song Break Stuff, Durst encouraged the crowd to be angry, and they were. Annual Pro-Life March. April 25, 2005, more than 1 million pro-life activists hit the mall in Washington as part of the March for Life. The annual March for Life rally is a rally of all ages from across the country. Every year, tens of thousands of pro-lifers converge on the National Mall and march on this Capitol Hill on the anniversary of the Supreme Court's 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling, which legalized abortion in all 50 states. It's the largest annual pro-life demonstration in the world. They celebrate each and every life from the moment of conception. They envision a world where every life is celebrated, valued, and protected. And now they have the Dobbs ruling by the Supreme Court to celebrate, because it totally reverses Roe v. Wade. And then this one, you may remember, Elian Gonzalez, a Cuban citizen, was in a heated international custody and immigration controversy in 2000 between his father, Juan Miguel Gonzalez Quintana, and other relatives in Cuba and in Miami. Gonzalez's mother drowned in November 1999 while leaving Cuba with Elian and her boyfriend to get to the U.S. She was with paternal relatives in Miami who sought to keep him to keep him in the United States against the father's wishes that he be returned to Cuba. The Southern District Court of Florida ruled that only Gonzalez's father could petition for asylum on the boy's behalf. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case, and Attorney General Janet Reno sent federal agents who took Elian from the paternal relatives at gunpoint and returned him to his father in Cuba. Very dramatic. And he's lived in Cuba, and he's certainly an adult by now, and he is, in fact, a true communist and supporter of the Cuban government. Effects on New Orleans of Hurricane Katrina. As the center of Hurricane Katrina passed southeast of New Orleans August 29, 2005, there were 23 breaches in the drainage canal and navigational canal levees and flood walls. Television images captured people grabbing electronics and other valuable goods from local retail outlets. The majority of the looters were hunting for bare essentials. It was way overreported. People confused looting with people going into survival mode. Fear of looting prompted local officials to overreact. Occupy Wall Street in 2011 in New York City. People protested against how poor and wealthy people have lived in different ways and are treated differently, and against corporations using their money. People started protesting in Zuccotti Park on September 17th, and some camped overnight. Soon it included several thousand people with many different political views. Protesters included communists, political moderates, liberals, conservatives, and libertarians. Occupy protests also started in the rest of the country. Then we have the murder of George Floyd. And you remember all these scenes and all of these events that took place throughout the United States. It was a violent reaction to what can only be called a murder. Now, tense protests and violence have continued in the U.S. over the death of George Floyd and other police killing of black people. Demonstrations broke out in more than 30 U.S. cities. It was an angry, angry time, a terrible reaction all throughout the country. So then we have another list of protests. It never ends. The Breonna Taylor one, and all the way down to Daunte Wright and so forth. And some of these are still ongoing. Some of these trials are ongoing. It seems like they never end. And then finally this one that we all remember too well.
On the surface, Wednesday started like so many Trump rallies had before. But the anger and the tension felt more intense. Congress was about to confirm Joe Biden's presidency, and most here were convinced it was a fraud.
Do you think people are angry today? Absolutely, people are angry, and you can feel it. You can feel the rage, the madness.
Before Trump's speech was even finished, many were already making their way to the Capitol. And as more protesters arrived, the mood darkened.
We're here at the Capitol steps right after the Trump speech was finished. People started filing over here and started pressing against the Capitol. Police are spraying mace and pushing the lines back so people can get through. We're going to move forward.
But as we pushed up,
Son of me, get the fuck out of here! Get the fuck out of here! Get the fuck out of here!
they tried to smash our camera.
Oh! Who can cover it? This is CNN.
Police started throwing flashbang grenades and spraying mace. As the crowd pushed up, one man flashed his handgun at a group of journalists. The cops weren't prepared. They had to take turns with the masks to protect from their own tear gas. The defense lines quickly fell apart.
are a protesting people, and we have been from the very beginning, and unfortunately, it has continued up until today. In any event, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we will move on to other topics. But remember, this is only part of the story, which never ends. And now you could do me a really big favor. If you did enjoy this presentation, it would really help me if you hit the like and subscribe buttons, because that will give me encouragement to produce even more of these special History by Lou presentations just for you.